Stack Overflow went from an obscure side project to the de facto brain of the internet, eventually sold for 1.8 billion, huge exit, and is now being publicly pronounced dead.
You had two different people, Joel and Jeff, the two founders, who were top bloggers, who had their own audiences that could command to bring everybody to show up on the first day that the site launched. Yep. We figured out that it's like, okay, let's take the valuation. We just raised that. Assume we want to fill it on the fundamentals of the business in 5 years. Somebody valued that company on a fundamental basis, call these a bankable business. So it's like, okay, let's make this a bankable business in 5 years. And the implication of that was we had to take the current revenue we had right now out of the jobs boards and the ads and double it every year for 5 years. And that was a combination of traffic's growing, the thing that you're trying to monetize is growing, starting to build a real business model and business value chain around the job board.
2026, everyone is calling time of death for Stack Overflow now. Do you think it's fair to actually say that the site and the business is officially dead?
I mean,
Stack Overflow went from being an obscure side project to literally becoming the backbone of the internet. It eventually sold for almost $2 billion, and now many are calling it dead. So what actually happened? Did AI kill Stack Overflow? There's no better person to answer these questions than Jeff Szczepanski, who served as Stack Overflow's Chief Operating Officer between 2010 and 2018, helping scale and monetize the business in its most important years. What you're about to watch is an insider conversation on the rise and fall of Stack Overflow, the forces reshaping it, and what comes next. You wouldn't want to miss it. Enjoy. So, Jeff, welcome back to the Heresy podcast.
Thank you.
Little known fact, you were actually the very first guest on the Heresy podcast.
Yeah, several years ago now, right?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, like more than 10, I believe. Is it more than 10?
That would make me feel old if it's
2016. But anyway, that story aside, I thought today we should talk about Stack Overflow and how Stack Overflow went from sort of an obscure side project at Fog Creek Software to the de facto brain of the internet, at least for software engineers, eventually sold for 1.8 billion, huge exit, and is now being publicly pronounced dead, right? One hell of an arc. You can literally write a movie about this. Yes. So I thought it's a good time for us to sit down and unpack this, because I think you're uniquely situated to actually talk about this rise and fall, or let's see if we would agree if it's a fall of Stack Overflow, because you were the exec in charge of monetizing and building the business for the better part of the existence of the company. Again, I'm kind of falling into the trap of pronouncing it dead myself, but you see where I'm getting with this. So I wanted to start with perhaps a question that I think has been answered many times, but I would love to hear your perspective, which is why Stack Overflow worked at a time when so many other websites didn't, and how it became the overnight success that everyone think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the angle, like in terms of like the community in the early days, like, do you mean, or like?
I think I would love to hear your take, because again, Joe was on the record talking about it and how the community was engineered and everything else. But again, like, I think there are certain things that only, I guess, people from the inside could see. And I'm particularly interested in your take, having joined very, very early on. Yeah. Right? So I'm kind of curious to hear your perspective holistically.
Well, I think, like all good businesses or companies that get built, there's a couple of key insights behind it. And, there's some really interesting lineage going into it. So like if I would say what I think the secrets of the success of the Stack Overflow formula was, you had two different people, Joel and Jeff, the two founders, coming and growing up with internet communities, Usenet groups, and this sort of stuff where there was this sort of web understanding of how communities worked, either in chat rooms and, IRC kind of stuff, all pretty much, sort of in the back room and only a smaller group of people using. And then the web took off, and the question of what are going to be the new forums. And I think you had the sort of the Reddits of the world. You had the Stack Overflow and the Stack Exchange Network, probably the two best examples. And then somewhere in there is like the other social networks that kind of really more optimized for engagement, where I think, Reddit did a good job. Obviously at Stack Overflow, I think we did a really good job of curating the community and realizing that you were trying to build a system that wasn't about content regulation. It was actually about shaping user behavior to have productive outcomes. Yeah. And so I think the modern social networks made the mistake, I think, of thinking that you're trying to like edit what people are allowed to say from the standpoint of allowed text, not allowed text, all these rules, lawyering it up, rather than looking at there's a person behind that speaking in a certain way. They sort of need to be taught and get acclimated to a culture and set of norms about how to behave, and not as a free speech question, but as a how do we behave in this forum? And so I think that was a well understood concept from the very early days of Stack Overflow. And the question was how to mechanize it into an interface that could productively produce questions. Wikipedia is another good example, and I think that's a very common reference point. If you think of the Stack Overflow community, the Reddit side of it in a sense, and then there's the sort of Wikipedia, we're trying to create a reference for the world that gets accessed by Google searches, and you show up on the right question and answer, hopefully, that provided value to the users in there. And so that was the machine that was running for many years, and I think we could talk about some of the, if you wanted to get into it, what we think the mechanics were that were at play about why Stack Overflow worked when a lot of these other communities didn't work. But the really quick, obvious one actually was that you had two programmers who were top bloggers who had their own audiences that could command an audience to bring everybody to show up on the first day that the site launched. I was there myself. This site happened, and you got all this liquidity all of a sudden against a basic mechanic. And in the first 60 days of the site, 180 days of the site, it was just about keeping the wheels from flying off. Is the content good? Are the behaviors good? And after having launched many other communities in the Stack Exchange network later, we realized that our hit rate wasn't necessarily good, even when you already had some of these liquidity benefits. So there's certainly some luck involved, I think, in getting it off the ground, and just sort of a love for that particular community in general. It was true to the people who were trying to make it.
Would you say that Joel and Jeff Atwood were uniquely positioned to do this and no one else could have done this based on what he said about?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I would say nobody else, but I think it could be mistaken on this, but I'd be willing to bet at the time that the number one and number two bloggers for people that had programming audiences from sort of two different sets of constituencies of programmers were represented by Joel and Jeff. This is a very good. And then the other shrewd thing they did while the site was being built was that there was a podcast documenting the weekly call with Joel and Jeff talking about the stuff. Because it was really Joel's idea, but Jeff Atwood was the one, along with two other programmers, actually sort of executing the vision under what Joel had originally had the idea of, and it's really Jeff, Jared, and the other Jeff, early programmers. Not this Jeff. I came just a little bit later.
Jeffs.
A lot of Jeffs. But those three, basically took gaming mechanics and some of the other kind of good insights around gamification, if you want to call it that, and the reputation system of how to build something that created the right incentives to go along with the behavioral shaping that was mostly in their minds. And
you made a great point. They were building out in the open before this was a known thing, right? Everyone now is all about building out in the open and putting your metrics out. Stack Overflow was, I would say, the pioneer in doing this, right? With the podcast.
I mean, we had a very, clear company value, which is default public. So another thing, we talked about everything in public outside of like personal, proprietary information, what people got paid or whatever. We didn't talk about that publicly, obviously, but anything else in terms of how we operated was blogging, podcasts within the meta community that supported Stack Overflow. And really the entire community was involved in the site's evolution, which was obviously a very important aspect of it as well. And
you mentioned just a minute ago that before you were the exec in charge of monetizing the entire Stack Overflow, or Stack Exchange, I should say, network, you were actually a user, a very, very early user, very active as well. So I've always wondered, at what point did you realize that Stack Overflow wasn't just a great website, which I think is often something people say, Stack Overflow is such a lovely website, but actually fundamentally a layer of the internet, right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, from a programmer's perspective?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that took a while, right? Like, in other words, I don't know if that became obvious. I don't know, it might be revisionist history in my mind, but I think the one thing I will say that was immediately obvious was, I don't know about day one, but day 3, day 5, certainly by day 10, you're like, oh, this is going to work. And it, maybe to your question, it did sort of say like, this is really interesting, right? Because you could ask a question and get an answer. And like, it was already working at that point. And then, it was already becoming a resource. I think it took a long time for it to settle in, like, lack of a better word, sort of a rock star status of Stack Overflow among programmers, you know? And I think it was because you had Joel and Jeff fans who were seeding the site. People like myself, they read Joel's blog and Jeff's blog. Very interested in what they were doing, just to follow along in the podcast even before the site launched. And at the beginning, it was very much like people knew who Joel was, people knew who Jeff was within the community because of how they came. Later we'd be walking in an airport and somebody would see our Stack Overflow logo and they'd be like, oh, Stack Overflow. And I'd be with Joel. We're traveling on a business trip or something. And they have no idea who Joel Spolsky is.
Oh, crazy.
Right? And I don't know exactly when that happened. That would have been like a few years into maybe a year or two after I started at the company, because, the community was going. It was like 2008. The VC money was raised to turn it into a business. Was 2010, and that's when I joined in that very first wave of hires beyond the original three developers.
So you actually you joined in 2010. This was on the back of the first institutional round.
Yeah, so I basically got raised with I joined right after the Series A closed, basically. So I think I was talking to Joel and the idea that it was going to happen before the Series A closed, but then joined the company.
Can you give us like a quick preview of I suppose this time between early 2010 to mid 2011, which is when I ended up joining. And I think I even remember my very first conversation with yourself and Joe and Guy. And by the time I joined, so much had changed. So I wonder what had actually happened. So that was like maybe 3-4 months. So I wonder what had happened from this entire year, 2010 to 2011.
Oh, like what was happening? Yeah. Well, it was, I don't know, I can talk about from my perspective as we start maybe transitioning into sort of the business aspect of Stack Overflow. We had this site, it was taking off. Traffic and like growth hacking and whatever was never a thing. Like the content, the quality of the content, and the fact that it was indexing into Google and people would just do their normal Google searches they were doing every day. More and more people were just finding Stack Overflow. And there was a very virtuous cycle there between what Google search results were returning, landing on the right question or answer, or then asking it. And you had some small percentage actually of those people who would actually help maintain the community, curating and stuff. So that was going on, and that snowball was running. And in fact, that started before I even joined the company, right? That's what really happened in 2008, 2009, 2010. And it was a big enough community that there was people interested in, from a venture capital perspective, to invest money in this thing, even though it doesn't really have a business around it yet. It's just this community. And that was Union Square Ventures, by the way, led to Series A. And then, so I joined. Joel also had this, blog, the Joel on Software blog, and some intern, I believe the story is, this is even before my time at the Fog Creek days, there's a Fog Creek intern that said, "Hey, Joel, you should put a job listings on your blog." And he's like, "I don't want any job listings on my blog." So somehow somebody, I think, coded it up and launched it, and said, "I'm going to, deploy it." Unless you say no, Joel. And he's like, "Okay, fine, let's see what happens. But let me call or email a couple of my friends and ask them to put jobs into the database so that there's something for people to look at."
Yeah.
Well, literally, this is like the best possible monetization you could have found for a blog. I think he's generating like $10,000 or $20,000 a month, just free cash flow and job listings being sold. Just swiping credit cards, no salespeople, no anything.
Yeah.
And that sort of stabilized based on the size of his office, size of his audience at some point. And so basically, when I joined the company, we bought the jobs board business from Fog Creek. And that became our initial seed of users, of customers, of a list of customers who had signed up that no one ever talked to or called or whatever. They just swipe credit cards, put job listings up. And that became the base of like the prospecting base to see, well, how do we get people to buy more job listings? And then the other thing was overlapping with this, there was a small ad unit on the website, which was just a typical display ad.
Yeah.
And in fact, before I started, there was a third-party company that was hired to manage that inventory and sell it to the customers. So when I started, the other thing was we basically took that in-house and, terminated the contract with the original parties.
And for many, many years, this was the primary driver of the monetization strategy behind.
Right. So a lot of people kind of assumed, because on the front face of it, that the ads business was the big business. And it was at the beginning, because there was just the jobs board. And we had a couple sales people were hired, and it's just like, here's a prospecting list just based on the database. And, the idea was to start optimizing that basically. And then the revenue started growing. And actually there was the original job board revenue, that we had. And, because we had raised VC, good valuation, it was, competitive, good opportunity to raise money. It's Joel Spolsky, it's Jeff Atwood. Whole story is really good for fundraising. And we got to figure out how to turn it into a real business. And so I sat down with Joel in the early days and said, "Hey, okay, it's like, how do I know I can go home at the end of the day and call it done for today? We want to make $1 billion company here or whatever, but you're going to do it one day at a time. What's the yardstick we're going to use?" So the yardstick we actually used was pretty straightforward. We talked about it for a few minutes. We figured out that it's like, okay, let's take the valuation. We just raised that and assume we want to fill it on the fundamentals of the business in 5 years. So basically that the cash flows of the company and the revenue that we were generating, if somebody valued that company on a fundamental basis instead of a sort of a VC basis, I call these a bankable business as opposed to like a Ponzi scheme business, right? We could talk about that more later, but it's like, you VC or a VC funded company is kind of a Ponzi scheme that you're looking to swap out with something that's bankable so that it can continue. So it's like, okay, let's make this a bankable business in 5 years. And the implication of that was we had to take the current revenue we had right now out of the jobs boards and the ads and double it every year for 5 years.
Yeah, which you did.
Which is exactly what happened. Yeah, that's exactly what we were able to do. And so, and that was a combination of, the traffic's growing, the thing that you're trying to monetize is growing, starting to build a real business model and business value chain around, the job board, which became more like a recruiting service, outsourcing service, sourcing service, maybe probably a better term.
Yep.
The ads business to grow, but we didn't want to like optimize ads because that has a set of tension with the user experience. Creating more inventory ad units. It's like there's a great business in, placing and helping programmers find jobs, very synergistic with the community, stuff like that. So that was the fundamental business.
Yeah.
And, what was interesting about that, I think, is that we kept finding a better business. Like, in other words, we would, we had the Series A, we did the money, we started executing against the plan. Sure enough, quarter after quarter, business growing exactly like you'd want it to. We could talk about, when you joined a year later, I wouldn't remember all the numbers that, off the top of my head here, of exactly where things are at. You might remember better, actually. But anyway, this idea was going, it was growing. And then, as more time goes along, it's like, oh, well, we're growing based on like, look at it as we got the VC money to spend. Do we want to make the company cash flow positive? Or do you continue the sort of bow wake of investing ahead of the revenue growth based on a predictable revenue growth profile to keep, instead of banking the money, keep the Ponzi scheme going where you raise more money and accelerate the growth. And so, we did a Series A, we did a Series B, we did a Series C, a Series D, all on that exact chain of events. Building it into a bigger and bigger business, but choosing for it not to be profitable. And just continue to invest ahead of that curve. And at any point, we could have like stopped spending money to invest in the company and sort of start milking it, or trade off between fast growth, keep doubling every year, versus hey, we'll take 25% growth, but we can self-fund that. Those would have been options, especially as we took more money, they become a little bit less of an option because you got to somehow figure out how to build the big business that those VCs expect to have. But that was the formula, and it worked extremely well, actually.
And we had so one thing which is interesting, years later, we launched Stackoverflow for Teams, which arguably became the biggest business or revenue generator, I should say, at Stackoverflow. I'm actually not sure if that is the case because I had left by that point.
The definition, So I was there for 8 years. I started in, it must have been July of 2010. I left early 2018.
Yep.
And this was the point where, after the Series D, but before the Series E, where we started running into this thing where, wow, we've built this whole jobs business, is what we called it, all of the sort of hiring programmer related services. It started looking to a lot of outside people, like from my perspective, it was starting to look like, oh, this is a low value multiple business. It's turning into a recruiting service. To be clear, at scale. At a pretty large scale in terms of the revenue and run rates and stuff. But those don't have great multiples. Like if this was a SaaS business instead, we would have a much better multiple, more predictable revenues long term. And somewhere in here in that time frame, GitHub was bought by Microsoft at even a better number than we sold at. Was it something like $7 billion? Do you remember?
8, I think.
8, maybe. Microsoft bought GitHub, and GitHub had sort of a community and programmers in a different way, right? But it also lended itself to turning into a SaaS product for all the reasons we can think about, right? So they basically started building an enterprise SaaS business around the basic idea of the GitHub community, and the software business through SaaS became the real business, as opposed to sort of the community side of it, And not that it isn't an important community in the way we even use it today, but not the same kind of dynamics you would think of in a Wikipedia or a Stack Overflow in terms of that interactivity. And so when that happened, and actually GitHub, I believe, had a major investment from Andreessen Horowitz. Our Series D investor lead was Andreessen Horowitz. And in a sense, from a board level, they're whispering into our ears saying like, SaaS business, SaaS business, SaaS business. And I'm like, you guys are underestimating. This is a great business. Like if we can own the interface to programmers, this is to me, that's even a better business. We just have to figure out more ways of monetizing it. And those weren't proven things yet, to be clear, right? Like, in other words, and so there was a bit of a dichotomy in the business actually at that point between, I would call it the more bankable business at the time to this sort of speculative notion of, can you take a company that built up an internet community and has job listings and job ads and different types of sourcing services and turn it into a software company that ships SaaS software? And in principle, of course you can, but at least from my point of view, that the company didn't have the DNA of that. Certainly not yet. That was going to require a major transformation.
Yeah.
And so what happened in the middle, that tension, and I would think about this differently now, but in other words, I learned things, sort of along the way, that there were sort of these two realities that were sort of competing with each other in the company. One of them was jobs business, how to turn the ad stuff into a depot, sort of branded depots of all the different things that programmers want to do to sell, buy, make decision choices and everything like that. Not like invading with display ads, but in a very rich way. And being able to monetize that in various forms, whether it's documentation being available there. I mean, turning the community and getting everything one-stop shop for programmers doing their jobs, basically, or finding jobs. And then there was hey, let's make a SaaS business. Yep. And they both made a lot of logical sense. I think one of the funny things was in the early days, when the company first started in the Stack Exchange, what people looked at before I even started was the idea that, we're going to have this community software, there's Stack Overflow, we're going to sell it to banks, and there can be a banking community, and there can be all these different things. And everybody can set up their own communities. But there was this really neat observation made at the time, which is like, well, wait a minute, do you want to be Yammer, which is like, community software for companies, or do you want to be Facebook and own all the communities? Yeah. That's the way we would talk about it as a thing, or even like a Reddit. Like, which one's the better business? It's like, you want to actually own the interaction interface, not just have the software company.
But we did come full circle to it eventually.
Well, right. That's exactly it, right? So that's kind of what I was getting at. So that was like the founding lineage story, but because of how the world evolved over the, 10 years in between 2008 and say 2018, SaaS businesses became this very clear VC model that if you could turn any sort of value chain into a SaaS business, like people know exactly how to value that, what it's going to be worth. And again, there was the GitHub had done that, felt similar enough, certainly to our investors, I think, that like should go do that. And I think there's nothing wrong with either one of these things, but there was sort of tension in the company, can you do both at the same time? Right. Which one do you pick? And ultimately it sort of came to a head, and the decision was made to say, like, we're going to turn it into a SaaS business.
Yeah.
And so then the jobs business and even the ad stuff, to some extent, I think that even still exists, turned into cash cows to milk as part of the funding story, to defray the risk. And then the Series E happened on the back of, this is going to be a SaaS business.
Yeah. Huge bet, obviously paid off at the end. But before we kind of look into this, I wanted to ask you again, around this idea of monetizing the communities as a selling it as a white label platform, Stack Overflow as a white label platform, if you will. Or I remember one of the early customers who actually tried to do that were Facebook, Meta now, Facebook at the time,
right,
and it didn't work. I remember meeting them here in London with Joe on one of his trips here, and still talking about why it didn't work, why it might have. Do you think there was something else apart from what you just said around this was a calculated business decision, largely influenced by our investors, or was there something that we figured out around community building that only the Stack Overflow team could do, and if we just outsourced the platform to someone else, it failed?
Right. Okay. I think there's a lot of really interesting questions on that. So like maybe the first one I would say is like, I could be wrong, but my reluctant history, if I remember the case point you're talking about, which relative to Facebook, was we were sort of doing two different things. One was ultimately the SaaS business, where it was more, I don't even call it white, you said white label, so maybe that's the confusion, right? So there's sort of what I think ultimately was called teams, which became spin up your own Stack Overflow instance in your company, and you can use the same Q&A services for internal questions and answers, right, whether it's programmers or the whole company, right? The basic knowledge-based information. Right. The Facebook effort, as I remember it, if it's what I'm thinking of, we also had this idea where we wanted to have like facebook.stackoverflow.com kind of things, where within the public community, there's a tag for Facebook related like programmers using the Facebook API and things like that, supporting their developer interface. their documentation, their question and answer. How do we get that on Stack Overflow where all the people are, rather than them having some sort of ticketing system, on the background where they somehow try to do developer support. And from my take on this, it's probably not fair to the whole thing, but I'll break it down really simple from my point of view, which is I think Facebook, when they were working with us to find a better way to support programmers, quote unquote, from our perspective, programmers in our community, they weren't trying to really have a better community, in my view. They were actually just trying not to have it be a headache. We don't want programmers emailing us anymore. We want this to go away. We're going to imagine there's this black box of Stack Overflow that just starts answering all our questions for us.
Right.
Versus other companies we worked with who were really thinking about as a deeper relationship with the programmers. We're going to support them better. They want to be on Stack Overflow. We will support Stack Overflow and even answer questions and support the stuff the way we normally would, except it goes through the Stack Overflow interface rather than through some other system, right?
Yeah.
And so instead of having these separate communities, they all got bounded into Stack Overflow. And so, yeah, that one did go sideways. I think there were other successful ones. And that actually is part of the evidence that lead us to saying, like, okay, let's start turning this more into a reproducible SaaS thing. We're not going to nurse every one of these only within programming, basically.
Were there any other bets that people don't know about? I mean, I couldn't think of any.
But you mean because of default public, most of it's out there. Like we would always talk about a lot of this stuff publicly. I don't know if I can think of anything. Sorry if it's a disappointing answer, but I think I can't think of any other major ones. I might be forgetting something though too. Maybe in the conversation something else will pop into my head.
Yeah.
But there was the things, and I think I'll single myself out and say that I was certainly an advocate of the idea of having the community become like the de facto depot, not only for programmers but for other things. We had the gaming site, big site, right? Gaming titles, and we could talk about why certain communities are likely to grow faster and be more successful than others. But the one challenge in that was the company DNA, and what we really knew was all in programmers and servicing programmers. That was the only community I think us as a company supporting it really loved and actually even understood completely, right? Mm-hmm. Gaming was close. There was a lot of other technical sites around it in the Stack Exchange network that all became good quality sites. In fact, we would kill off the ones that didn't work. The question is like how to really expand the footprint of Stack Overflow as a relationship with developers, and how do we have other Stack Overflows for other communities, oil well drillers or whatever, anything that's got like a lot of geekiness around it, that's specialized information in that community. And in fact, it's a little bit of a tangent, but Joel always had this great test that I will never forget around, what makes a good community, or how do you know it's a good community, is you show up on the homepage and you not only don't understand, you don't know what the answers to the questions are, but you don't even understand the questions. Because if it's all, geek speak in some language, then these are some people who are going to find that as a home. That's how you know you got a good community going. If it's all generic, I guess I'll pick on Quora, generic answers. What did you have for lunch today, or whatever? How to cook a fish in a dishwasher or something, right? Like those are all just sort of general mass interests, but those don't hold community because they don't fly any freak flag, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so those, I think, are the valuable ones, the ones where you don't understand the questions and the answers.
Isn't this the complete opposite of where the internet has gone nowadays?
Well, that's what's the bizarre thing, right? And I think you're opening up a whole other thing, which is like, well, the echo chambers and the various weirdness, are win, but more in this weird sort of manipulative way. Yeah. I mean, I think still today, good communities have this property, but the major websites don't, right? Like, in other words, again, they looked at it as content moderation, not community building. I think Twitter was always trying to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. They just somehow, couldn't make it happen at scale, certainly. Yeah. Facebook, they obviously just optimized for growth, right? Like they didn't seem to care, you know what I mean? Yeah. Or at least they didn't understand the cost, or were naive to the cost of what they were doing. In other words, how it could be now in today's terms weaponized and, just leveraged in many different ways that aren't really ideal.
Yeah. So can we talk about the community for a little bit? Because it's always, I kind of find it's a bit of a Marmite story. A lot of people love the Stack Overflow community, and there has obviously at times been public outcry about how ruthless the community could be, the moderators, etc. A lot of it, if you go and listen to some of Joel's early presentations around how Stack Overflow was built intentionally, he actually outright says this is very much by design. A lot of the strict rules around it, and this is not so that we can be mean, but so that we can leave a valuable artifact on the internet. We don't want any opinion-based answers. We don't want people kind of asking very specific questions, for example, that only serve their interests. We want an artifact that would last for for a very long time.
Right.
Not many people saw it that way, though, right? Like some people understood it.
Well, yeah, I don't know. So like, yeah, so it's a good question, first of all. So the first thing, actually, the first disqualifier I will throw up is I know enough to be dangerous about communities. Like my job daily was not running the communities. There's a great guy named Jay Hanlon who was really responsible for the communities, had these moderators who really deeply understood running communities. And Joel being one of those people, by the way, and Jeff, like in other words, really understanding at a deeper level what makes them successful and why. I would say that some of these rules, they made it mean and different things like that. I'm not going to say that those are necessary, but they are very natural outcomes given the behavior of humans to get the quality you're looking for, right? So there's a sort of a trade-off there.
Right.
And I think if you make no rules and you have nothing, then you get, X now, right? And they're just saying, that's illegal. You can't say that. That's about bomb making. Right. Like if it's a content moderation rather than a behavioral shaping behavior, attacked, then you end up with X and Facebook. If you go to saying reshaping behavior, then you start to run into things that Joel would have said, I think the one you're referring to is, there's tension here, and some of these rules matter. The only thing I would say, I think, and this has changed maybe in more recent times, this is just a belief or a theory, I would say, is that I think the dichotomy between it seems friendly and helpful all the time and good content is a more technically solvable problem nowadays at scale because of language models. Mm-hmm. And thinking about not to just, filter the content as this bomb making, violating some rules like models are used for today, or just hacking, the dopamine head and that kind of feedback loop, but a feedback around saying we got certain values and types of content that we're looking for. Are we getting that content, and who are the offenders in here? Mm-hmm. And what do we do to shape their behavior? I think that's much more doable at scale. 10 years ago, certainly at the time Stackoverflow started, that would have been beyond the technology other than maybe simple sentiment analysis and stuff to try to do automated things. In other words, you needed humans moderating, and they needed to think about it as behavioral shaping and community. And given that formula, it's very easy for the community to start doing things that feel very draconian to newcomers. Yeah. And I do think that dichotomy can be broken. One of the things that I would say that I would also think that goes on for good communities is that your branding and your marketing to the community should be really instilling the values you want. So Stack Overflow, I would say, was super very much around servicing programmers and getting you good answers. Core to the value wasn't being friendly along the way. You know what I mean? Like that was implied, but not explicit to the people, right? So you get a lot of people answering questions every day, and you see newbies coming in and they do bad things. You've seen that 50 times. You've moderated it 50 times. Right. The tool's not smart enough to moderate that for us. So therefore, that person gets cranky and says things, either in the question, the answer, the comments, that isn't the most welcoming way of handling it. I think that's just sort of human behavior. What can you do to enhance that? Now I think there's many more technical options for that, from a system that could realistically support that.
Would you say some of just going back on what you just said around enhancing dopamine in users, would you say that some of the gamification was that put in place was essentially doing exactly that, but at the same time, it was working for the greater good of the community? What I mean is you answer a question, you're rewarded with points, or you ask a great question, whatever it might be. So this kind of undoubtedly releases some sort of dopamine hit in your body.
Fair point.
So on a psychological level, you're like absolutely stimulated to go and answer more. But in doing so, you essentially are building the bank of question and knowledge of the internet. So I kind of feel like Stack Overflow managed to get it right in the sense that they achieve this dopamine hit that the users now crave by scrolling on the internet or recording stupid content but at the same time actually producing the great artifacts that Joel wanted, right? So it's kind of, I feel like they almost did the impossible, right?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. So there's one thing I like to think about, which is just this idea of like, what's the difference between love, like doing a loving action for somebody and helping them versus manipulating them? Right. And in other words, a good form of love is manipulation. The only difference between manipulation and love actually is whose interest you have in mind when you're doing it. Right. So if you have that person's interest in mind when you're doing it, that's love. You're showing the love. Right. If it's, you're trying to get something you want, then you're manipulating them, right? So I think of the reputation system and stuff as a form of love because you're using a whole gamification to manipulate them to do the very thing that programmer wants, which is a great community, great questions, great answers. There is collateral damage in this and the cranky behaviors that we talk about as like a side effect, but for the most part, it's a very successful, valuable service. And yeah, you get the idea there, right? So like, I think that's the tension. The other thing I would say is that, and smarter people than me, especially around communities, might disagree with this in some way, but my way of thinking about this is, people were really doing it for the reputation. To me, the reputation is the thing you point at that makes you feel good yourself to say, this is what I got. I have more privileges in the system because of this rating. They are doing it because they genuinely want to somewhere between show that they're smart and express their knowledge and help people. Yep. That's the real thing. The other thing is just the accounting that makes you go, it's like when you get paid. You have a job, a good job, you're making a salary. Yeah, I got to put food on the table. But the number that you make, if it's a job you love, is just, that's the thing. Oh yeah, that's why I work so hard.
Yeah. And that reputation had other ways of actually being useful for the user. And one of the ways is, going back to your points earlier, was how we ended up building the talent business, right? A lot of the reputation, even though it wasn't intended that way, became a proxy of how good of a developer you were in a way, right? Would you agree? Or at least in the community? Yeah,
I think there's some signal in that. I think the reputation for the most part was probably a better proxy to just how much you contributed to Stack Overflow. Right. Than say necessarily how good of your program. But yeah, I think there's a correlation without causation in there or something, right? Like at some level, I think that's true. Yeah, and certainly, as you know, I think you're alluding to it. Within the jobs business, when we were trying to match jobless and job business, the idea that they had a reputation and a corpus of questions to draw on helped you match them programmatically to jobs, right? Yeah. So which job ad am I going to put in front of you? Which one am I going to recommend? How are we going to sort them? Yeah, people's actions were there. The problem was, and this gets into a whole other area of the business, which was, as a percentage of users, something well under 10% of people had ever even asked a question, let alone answer one. I think if I remember my numbers. And the people that actually had ratings, reputations, I should say, that grew over time, logged in every day, participated in the community, that was sub 5%, more like 1%. So from a jobs perspective, if you got 10 million programmers coming to the website all the time, 1% of those, you actually know who they are and have some real actionable data on them. Yeah. And there's a whole parallel here we could talk about to like Google's transition from flyby users in Google search to everybody has a Google account and is logged in and has a real profile behind them. I always looked at Stack Overflow as trying to go through the same evolution. People think of, Google circles or whatever it was, these things as failures. But remember, we all switched from flyby users to Google to real accounts, whether it was Gmail or whatever. The value of that network and that flyby traffic, just like our flyby traffic at Stack Overflow, directly proportional to what else you can keep on them to start doing these other things.
Yeah. This is probably a good segue into the effing orange box. Can we talk about? I don't know, by the way, if you're wearing an orange jumper intentionally today.
No, actually, it was blue box. Blue. Yeah, blue. Our ad unit was a blue box for the job ads, right? Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'll let you tell the story. But.
Well, I think it's great coming from you because you were one of the people who felt the most passionately about it. Again, this had a direct implication on how the business was monetized, and it ties back to what you just said, right? The fact that we didn't know who those people were had an impact on how much and what we could do with all the traffic, right?
Right. Okay, so yeah. So I think maybe what you're surfacing, this is the fun part of the discussion.
Maybe mention the context of the.
Okay, so the effing blue box relates to a talk I did. We had a company meetup in
San Diego.
San Diego. I was going to say San Francisco. Oh, San Diego. San Diego. The whole company at the thing, because we were a distributed remote company, it wasn't that common in the early days. I guess lots of companies that way now, but back then it was pretty unique that we were a distributed company with a small number of offices. And I don't know, this is probably 2016?
2015, I think it is.
2015?
Yeah, even 2014, but I think it's 2015.
Okay, yeah, so somewhere around there. So, I've been at the company at this point 5 years. We're building this business. I can't remember exactly where it might have been like after we raised the Series D, maybe, something like that. I don't remember the year, or maybe somewhere between the C and the D. So, we got this business. We've raised a lot of VC capital, VC money at this point. And the backstory of the inside of the company, from my perspective, is that most people that were hired into the company, certainly all the technical people, came into the company because they're programmers and they love Stack Overflow. And this is an amazing site. I get to work on Stack Overflow as the product. And, part of the ethos of the community, in fact, remember the company was founded on, we're not Experts Exchange.
Yeah.
So Experts Exchange, if people don't remember, was a Q&A site that existed on the internet that built up this whole corpus of stuff that everybody contributed for free. And then one day they decided to put a paywall up and start charging money to get access to the very things they helped create. So I don't know, I'd have to ask Joel. I don't remember the exact origin story of the idea, but I think Joel was like looking at, hey, that's not good. Like we could make a better, not just a normal PHP, BB, bulletin board type group. We can make a real machine that is a site that, does all the things we know about in Stack Overflow. Could do a way better job at this. And in fact, a really funny story is if you look at the early days of Stack Overflow, our growth, our traffic curve and expert sustained traffic curve, exact opposite directions, right? So everything, we were just taking away all of their traffic and, basically put it into the new, better form. Anyway, so you had all these people that are coming to the community. We're doing this for the programmers. Inside the company, there was this tension between we're doing this thing because we love it, and it has to be a service to programmers. All the content is under Wikipedia. We can't be Extras Exchange. We can't turn into the evil empire that we just, are killing off. But at the same time, we had raised, I don't know, I think at that point, something like $40 or $80 million in total venture capital. It was probably 40 to 60 at that point, something like that in VC. And, I had to get in front of the company and say, like, I don't know why it doesn't matter why you think you're here, but we raised all this money. There's like serious people out there that the only success case for us is we make $1 billion company here. Like anything else, we can be happy about the community, but we failed from what the very people did. It's like, this just exists. Yeah. And so this ties into that talk where I was basically sensitizing people in sort of a shock therapy and got them to the, I had a point at the website and say, the only thing we're monetizing things through is this little fucking blue box ad unit. I said, you can't build $1 billion company on a blue box. And what I was really trying to do is create the sense of urgency in the company to start taking all the creative juices that we had building a better community and the energy in that and start saying, we got to really start figuring out how to turn this jobs business or the ads business, break the dichotomy. Let's not do all the stuff of just slapping more display ads on and more display impressions and not do these things. The jobs business is the thing that the programmers need. We just need to do it in a loving way and essentially bring them into that. And that was a key juncture for the company in terms of like, oh, okay, we're going to start getting serious about this. And that, in a sense, from my perspective, allowed the jobs business to continue to grow the way we did to more innovation, changing the product from just basically job ads that are still just ads, but good ones from a programmer standpoint, and figuring out how to enrich that into a better, more turnkey solution. Because the fundamental problem we had on the site was that you had all this traffic, and we charged the same exact price for any job listing, except that if you were Google, hypothetically, and they bought a job listing for $495, they're going to get, 1,000 applications. Some other programming job and some other company in Missouri, nothing wrong with Missouri, but small town in Missouri is hiring a programmer, same exact job spec that, Google or somebody else needed from a technical perspective, puts the same job ad up for the same $495, and they get no applications, or they get one or two. And we know for sure that we can target all the programmers in Missouri. I can tell you how many they are. They come to the website every day. We can see those people. We can target them. But that company, in a sense, doesn't know how to target those people with the right kind of language. Google has a brand. They got free lunches. They got all these reasons why people go to Google, especially the smart, people that they're trying to hire. Lots of other smart people. They don't want to move to California. They don't want to work for Google. They like what they're doing as a programmer, but maybe they're in a bad job and they need to find a better one down the street at some other shop. And so like that was the fundamental thing, is like you started realizing that it wasn't our fault that these job ads didn't surface the right things in the right ways to programmers, but it was definitely our problem. And as you know intimately, right, this became part of the whole sales proposition of like, how do you educate people trying to hire programmers to behave more like Silicon Valley companies, at least from an ad perspective, but ideally even culturally, to start realizing that, Joel used to have all kinds of funny examples about all the good ways of treating programmers, hire sheep to keep their feet warm, or, give them, free foods and lunches or whatever they need, because you're paying that person $150,000. It's worth it to spend $5,000 on nice stuff, to have the better programmers, right?
And we did do.
That was the evolution of the jobs business. Without getting all the details, it was to turn it more into, in effect, we're trying to figure out ways of pricing things so we can charge you per hire and the value you're getting out of it rather than the impressions that you're using. Even though that's obviously a technical problem for us.
Fun story. That was the very last business I worked on, a Stack Overflow. Well, we
before you left?
Yeah, well, we ended up calling Developer Insights. So I think, I was entrusted by yourself and Joel to basically launch this, which was a lot of fun. On that note, so I left you were with the company for another couple of years at least, and then you moved on, and less than a couple of years after, the company got acquired for 1.8 billion, which by your account is I think a great outcome. But I do remember, and I think you mentioned some of our investors earlier, I do remember having a conversation with one of our investors just after the news broke, and I explicitly remember him saying, well, that's a great outcome, but we should have really been GitHub, right?
Oh, I see. Who said that? You're saying?
One of our investors.
Oh, I see. Well, yeah, that's kind of crazy thing, right?
And
Yeah.
you kind of poked around this earlier, right?
Well, right, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I mean, Stackoverflow obviously ended up in a success story in terms of an exit. Everybody made good money. The Series A people, amazing return.
Yeah.
Everybody, it was a good outcome, right? Multiple of 1.8 billion instead of. What the latest valuation is. So it was really a good outcome. Maybe the latest investors, but they weren't in very long either, right? So certainly a great investor story. But yeah, I think there was a frustration among the board and the GitHub exit. Like, why isn't it $8 billion? At some level, I think people felt like there was something squandered there.
Do you feel that way?
No, I don't. I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, only in a crazy VC-ish kind of world can you look at a company like Stack Overflow and not call it a success. I'm not saying their frustrations weren't founded in the sense that somehow we didn't manage as a team, and I include everybody, including myself, at a board level, company level, management level, to have it really well aligned what we were doing and exactly why, right? So there was, in a sense, there was sort of envy of other types of things, and actually, in VC terms, it took a long time, right? Like it was beyond the 10-year window when we exited. They really want to see that happen faster.
Yep.
And so that's a reason, for various VC funding reasons and stuff that's not necessarily good. And so I'm very empathetic to their point of view. Do I look at it that way? No. I mean, I don't. I mean, I think, it's a fantastic exit. I joined at the Series A.
Yeah.
Lots of people made money. I think Jeff Atwood was quoted as saying something like 60 millionaires were minted the day we sold or something like that.
26, I think.
Was it 26?
I think so.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
But that's still a great outcome.
Yeah, I was thinking it was 86, but maybe I'm wrong. Either way, it was anybody that held on to their stock would say the company made really good money, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's a great exit story, especially because some of these very people were, the whole side thing, are other Fog Creek employees. Yeah. So they had stakes in Trello. So this was
26 from employees, by the way. I think this was 26 employees.
Right.
So a lot more.
Yeah, people who were hired after the Series A or whatever.
Yeah, so it could have been, I don't know.
Founder-wise or whatever. Yeah,
and investors.
Great story.
Everyone made.
Yeah, investors, founder, fantastic, life-changing money. Yeah, no question. I mean, 1.8 billion times any percentage is a lot of money, at least in, sort of real people terms. So, yeah, I mean, it's a great exit, right? I'm sorry, I forgot your question there, though. You were driving.
I was just asking.
What happened?
It was more. It's to do with this idea that we should have been GitHub, right?
Right.
In the sense, hey, we only
GitHub
sold for $2 billion and not 8.
Right.
And I'm thinking, the question was, do you feel that indeed we should have been GitHub? Should Stack Overflow have been, I don't know, like an 8 billion or 4 billion outcome? And do you think we actively could have made that happen?
Right. Well, I will definitely say this. I was definitely surprised by the exit because the transition to the SaaS business was hard. And, there was this race between building a SaaS business and the fact that the the jobs business, careers we also called it, along the way somewhere, that business was no longer being invested in. So it was being milked, but it's starting to shrink at some point. The cannonball kind of continued in the air for a little while, a year or two after I left. But then and that's where the sort of fork in the road was, hey, we're going to turn it into a SaaS company.
Yeah.
And, we're going to milk the cash cow of the ads in the careers business and replace the revenue over here. I don't know all the detailed numbers. It's after I left. But, I think that was challenging, right? To try to even just hold the revenue growth constant.
Yeah.
And that's not unexpected. I think that was the big risk, is how do you transform the company? And so somewhere in there is the GitHub end of you, because this is where I think that the parallel to GitHub and Stack Overflow is not fair. GitHub, everybody's logged in. Everybody has an account. They know who all these people are. And it's a key part of a developer workflow. Everybody's got to have a, revision, a source code management system. And so, in a sense, the value of every GitHub user was higher than the value of an individual, Stack Overflow user. And the secret, I think what you alluded to before, was our ability to build communities, not necessarily to be a SaaS software company, right? And so the whole company had to be transformed into a SaaS model. And as soon as you handed the software over to companies, can they manage a community internally? And part of the early days, even when I was still there, we launched, essentially internal versions of Stack Overflow into various early customers. And it took a while for us to be able to sort of productize the process of them successfully spinning up those communities. Otherwise, they just died inside of the company and there was no value. And in fact, I wish I could remember her name to credit it. There was credit her. we hired somebody to be like a customer relationship manager very early in the Teams business of the software. And she was actually hired out of somebody who had used the Stack Overflow engine internally to get it deployed and successful in her own company. It was like, it's one of the banks or something like that. I forget who it was. Right. And she joined Stack Overflow. She was the person that chartered and led the effort within inside of the company to have the Stack Overflow engine support their employees within their Q&A network of the Stack Overflow software. She became a member of the company, and she had a very good, consciously competent way of thinking about how you're going to get a company to successfully bootstrap the community in the same way that Joel and Jeff were able to do it with programmers. How do you do it inside of, Microsoft, or how they were their customer, I believe, or how do you do it inside of, Chase National or Chase Bank or something like that. And so I credit her actually with figuring out how for us to go from just it's instinctive, we know how to run a community because we've been in communities our lives, online, into like you could train somebody how to do it in a formal way. Yeah. And that actually was, to me, is what enabled the business to be powered from there. But then again, you still got to productize all that in a whole, not only the software and have all the features that Stack Overflow didn't have that enterprises needed in combination with all the sort of whole product stuff to wrap around it so these communities would thrive.
Yeah. Awesome. Going back to the exit. So Prosus buys the company.
Yeah.
For almost 2 billion, 1.8. What do you think they actually bought? I keep on asking myself, did they buy the traffic, the brand, the community? Again, we can do the revisionist history here because
right.
I think the answer in 2021 when the deal was finalized probably looked different to just a couple of short.
Well, right. So
years later.
I mean, there's the whole sort of AI segue that happens in here, and like what's happened to Stack Overflow as a community since then is really interesting. Yeah, honestly, I don't know. I mean, I wish I could give you an answer. I'm sure I could give you sort of what I've sort of heard. I never met the Prosus team or anybody that, like, I wasn't involved in the deal. It was after a couple of years after I left that the exit occurred. So yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting. Yeah, I think, to say whether they got a good deal or not, or whether they overpaid, I think is baked into whether or not what they thought they bought.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think history is probably showing, I mean, the big value in it, if we jump way ahead in the timeline, the core value of Stack Overflow that remains is its Q&A database for training models.
Right.
Right. Because I even think the fundamental idea of building a SaaS business, the Q&A model is being disrupted in the same way Stack Overflow community is being disrupted. The Q&A knowledge model is being disrupted in the same way. Yep. Now, can Stack Overflow as a company build a new thing using AI models probably to build another better next generation Q&A system? Yeah, certainly it's possible. But I think it's hard to imagine that the ongoing value of Stack Overflow supports the price that they paid at the time, right? Like, in other words, say that it's worth 1.8 billion today.
Yeah.
1.8, 1.6, 1.8 billion.
1.8, yeah.
Yeah, 1.8 billion. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to know more about their numbers and stuff. But certainly hasn't grown a lot.
No. Well, this is a good segue into, how we open this conversation. It's obviously 2026 and everyone is calling time of death for Stack Overflow now. And there was this chart that you actually sent me over WhatsApp. It was you, right?
I probably,
which shows the traffic.
The chart, the upside down U.
Which is not what you want to see.
Right, traffic curve is an upside down.
Yeah, and basically what it was showing was that the traffic the Stack Overflow is getting right now is at the same level, if not below, what it was at launch. Right.
And this is, to be clear, I don't know if anybody in the company has confirmed this or not, but like people looking at internet traffic results are various ways of estimating it. Yeah, I think the curve showed that it's back where it was in 2010 before I joined the company originally, which is crazy, right?
Right. So crazy. I guess a couple of quick questions here. Number one, do you think it's fair to actually say the site is officially, and the business is officially dead? Well, let's start here, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
or is it premature, you think?
I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thing. Certainly in the form that we knew it's dead, right? Like, in other words, I think the traffic just shows that, right? Like, in other words, it can't function at the same level of scale. And there's much better ways to get answers to questions now for most of these things that we think of doing, right? Like, so now we could, speculate whether their questions and answers are just as good using, GitHub Copilot or whatever your favorite tool is. Yeah. But it's pretty amazing, right? Like, I program, I do Python stuff. I mean, I can take an output of a stack dump crash of some program and give it to ChatGPT or, Claude Code, and like, it'll tell me what's wrong with my code, right? Like, that's the real answer people are looking at, right? The Eric Schmidt used to talk about Google, do they want a bunch of web page results in their search, or do they want just the answer to the question in a box at the top? Well, if it's a one and done, they want the answer at the top. Language models and stuff are much closer to getting your answer as opposed to what you're going to do on Stack Overflow. And the one thing to remember about Stack is that people's user experience wasn't asking a question and getting an answer. People's experience was going to Google, typing the question in, and getting the answer that was already answered on Stack Overflow. So there's like a whole bunch of stuff in that value chain being skipped with the language model, assuming that it's based on stuff that language models know or can tell from
well, the only thing that you can argue here though
base.
is that Google have found a way, because obviously their business was being cannibalized, or they were in a real predicament where they either had to cannibalize their own search business to build the AI business, right? And some people would argue that that's why they were sort of late to the AI race. A little bit.
Right, they have a bit of innovator's dilemma there, if nothing else.
Exactly.
But
But they're now in a great position, and Stack Overflow is not in a great position, right? So you can argue people might not go to Google directly for answers, but Google is doing just fine, or will be doing just fine. Stack Overflow, I don't know if you can make that case.
Right. As a community, I think it's really tough because people just aren't going there. When in the heat of 2010, 11, 12, business growing great. We got the careers, jobs business going. We got the ads. We're making money, doing VC rounds, all great picture. Joel and I would sit down and talk about existential threats to the business. I talk about this nowadays more in I call them meteors, the meteor that kills the dinosaurs, right? They're all just going about their business and some disrupts you, right? And I personally thought that people, because Stack Overflow was such a phenomenon, it was like, oh, what's going to disrupt us, kind of thing. It was a common thing because everybody's got to use it. Of course, Joel and I, the obvious one was, for us, certainly, was Google itself, because remember, the experience of Stack Overflow wasn't somebody goes to stackoverflow.com because they typed it in and looks up a question or an answer. Google search was better because, of course, right, better than our own internal website search. So everybody went to google.com, types in their programming question, and people just got trained, and along with the algorithm, to just have all the Stack Overflow stuff be at the top of the things. So our existential threat is, we rely on Google to send us the traffic because we don't really own any of the traffic. And this is true of most websites in the world, actually, in various ways. But, for Stack Overflow, it was core to the machine because nobody else got in there any other way. That's the way people learned about the brand. And, so you can see this phenomenon. And in fact, this also tied into the monetization strategy because you didn't want to have existential reliance on Google both for your traffic and your monetization, right? In other words, if we just farmed it out to, AdSense or whatever, Google's on both sides of it. They're going to squeeze us dry like most other companies get squeezed dry. So we clearly had to have a different monetization strategy and think about and talk about ways of getting people to use stackoverflow.com directly, which I saw, the brand engagement of people and the careers job stuff is the way, right? In other words, what are people doing when they're not actually doing a programming query in the middle of coding experience? Yeah. They're going to come to Stack Overflow for these other reasons. We never got the business to the point of proving out a way of doing that, right? This is where we hit the fork in the road in 2018 and decided it's going to be a SaaS business now instead of a programmer community.
So with that in mind, and we have to assume the premise that Stack Overflow indeed has been murdered. Would you say the murder weapon was large language models, or do they actually expose something else that already existed, as you just described?
Well, yeah, right. I think you got to say that it existed. It's really funny. We would talk about internally not only the Google existential threat, but people would be like, I would also just put forth the general idea that Stack Overflow will be disrupted. This is just meteors come.
So it's
hard to see what they are, and it's hard to get people in the company to think about reasons. But what do you do to shore up the things against the meteors? I mean, I didn't envision the language models, right? And in fact, I think most people didn't. Even when GitHub was starting to do stuff for the programmer in line, and our traffic started, Stack Overflow, I should say, it was around the time that I left the company. The language models were starting to get used as part of the programming experience within, the IDE environments. And so our traffic was starting to flatten out, and it wasn't, because it would be a little bit bumpy and stuff, it wasn't really clear that, why it was maybe slowing down or flattening. It wasn't an obvious trend until you already see it kind of going down, right? And so, it's a really interesting thing in there. Yeah, I think the existential threat was then found. But my point in there was that I think it took me a year to realize, that's the thing that's going to kill this, right? And it took a while, like it always does, innovator's dilemma style, whatever. There's a disruption, there's a meteor. It takes a while for the company or even the world to realize, this is existential. Fortunately, interest rates are low. Company sold at exactly the right time.
Yeah.
If you look at that upside down U with the traffic growth where the exit occurred it's exactly where it wasn't clear whether it wasn't still growing or whether it was going to go south. 12 months later, it's absolutely obvious
Yeah.
after that the thing's going to go south. So there's a lot of luck in the timing of exactly when that exit goes.
Do you think that the new management team after the exits could have affected this outcome? What has just kind of unfolded in the last couple of years?
Well, that's getting hit by a train, right?
Right.
That's a really hard one. And I sit down and think, as I was COO of the company for 8 years, and they were leading the monetization. I mean, every time we get together with dinner with some of the other, ex-stackers, I sit down and think about strategically, okay, if I was CEO of Stack Overflow, what would I do? It's hard to come up with a really good answer, right? It's a hard to solve problem. I think there are answers. It's a much longer conversation, but there's no easy answers, and there's certainly nothing assured in there, right? There's no obvious thing to be doing.
Yeah.
It's one that got hit by a bus because, it just happens, right?
Well, so would you view large language models as parasitic to Stack Overflow or then kind of natural successor? And in that, I guess, kind of what I'm poking around is this idea of potentially selling the content on Stack Overflow upon which pretty much every single large language model has been trained, right? Can you...
Right. So clearly, they changed the terms of service so that the stuff that was under Creative Commons license got changed so that people couldn't just freely do it. And I think there was publicly announced deals. That's all I really know about them. Deals where the stuff was licensed to Google and probably OpenAI and stuff to use for training. The problem is there's no machine to build more of that, right? In other words, the whole world is sort of squeezing the sponge of pre-existing content to build these models. It's not clear
so what happens
what the horizon is moving forward.
Exactly. So what happens from now on? Because obviously we had all these artifacts, again, let's use Joel's language.
Right.
Conveniently created over the previous decade that large language models can learn from and become the code wizards that we believe they are today. What happens from now on when no one actually has created that content?
Yeah.
How do they keep on evolving and learning?
It's a really good question. I think, hopefully, there's different ways to think about it. So I think what made Stack Overflow uniquely valuable is a good quality content, humans in the loop. What's still happening now is you got a whole bunch of code bases in GitHub and either privately or publicly that have comments in them, and people are keeping track of all these conversations that are having in chat. In theory, that's mineable. We could debate whether the quality and usefulness of it is the same as what you would have gotten from a Stack Overflow in the early days. But, so I think there's stuff out there. There's a really interesting thing about language models that I read, just to, help everybody have a sense of this, because I didn't fully appreciate it until I heard the point, which is if you train a model on a whole bunch of source code and examine its ability to program, fix the code, do all kinds of things, is directly related to whether there's how good the comments are in the code. So if you took a whole bunch of code that did various things and stripped all of the comments out of it and tried to train a model over it, it don't work nearly as good or at all, and I suppose in the extreme case, to know what the hell's, because there's no English tied to what the hell's going on in the code base, right?
Yeah.
So you need, in a sense, you kind of intuit it, right? You need well-documented code describing what it does to have, through various forms of information, information sources, to provide the very thing that the model's trying to extract from it, right? These models are, famously called, infamously maybe, stochastic parrots. It's just, I see the models as just a really good user interface to a very sophisticated database, right? In other words, human text in, human text out, and programming content out. And as we see in AI applications today, that's one of the few business cases around AI that's, I think, is probably actually really working because of the notion of context-free grammars, how programming languages work, the fact there's a lot of information to train these things with. Programmers are kind of specialists and can deal with technology issues and the warts and all this today. So, you got some, Claude Code and various tools out there in the different vibe coding spaces that are doing kind of interesting things. Now, are they generating production code, and how much does it improve productivity? Still an open question, but it's very promising. And as a programmer myself, technical background, how else do you get a job at Stack Overflow? Yeah. If you're not a great salesperson, was being a programmer. When I sit down and do stuff in Python or whatever, playing around with models today, it's astounding how much programming has changed in the last couple of years as a result of the capability of these models. The job has definitely changed. Is the job going away? No, I don't think so. Not anytime soon.
So you do believe this? That was going to be my next question. What happens to your average developer? I had this really interesting conversation with Philip Su, who you might remember from Meta at the time. He actually was at OpenAI, launched their Seattle office. And we kind of went deep on what happens to programming as a discipline. And his take was that only the top 5% of developers are likely to survive the onslaught that is coming. So
Well, I don't know. It depends what we assume there. I think,
Right.
like, in other words, if we assume that we build a self-aware AGI, I guess for lack of a better term, that knows how to program, then then it's people, right? And then the only question is sort of the economics behind it, right? Like,
Right.
how much power I put in the data center, how many processors do I need? What's the depreciated cost of that relative to the cost of a human doing the same exact thing, and scarcity, those kinds of questions, right? If you assume that, and I think that's a big stretch, or at least that's a long ways off, I don't think it's anywhere close to 5%. The thing that I do think, certainly everybody's workflow is changing. I think if you don't change your workflow, you're sort of a dinosaur in that regard, because your productivity as a programmer, I think, certainly in theory, should be increasing over time here rapidly. But to me, basic economics tells you don't have less programmers in the world, you have more programmers in the world because they can do more and they're more valuable. Like, in other words, basic supply and demand is as output goes up, or effectively price per line of code or whatever goes down, more people want to use more code for doing more things. The only time that means employment of programmers drops is maybe two cases. One is the one we just said, the existential one where, you have very cheap machines just doing it all. And we could talk about that, but I think that's a long ways off for various reasons. It's not before 2030. I don't think so. But there is another segment of programs, which is a lot of people doing, for lack of a better word, like throwaway websites for some branding promotion. It's, discount at something during Christmas or whatever. Websites are built for that. Internal IT tools that are basically just ticketing systems with wrappers put around them. Very light programming, very consistent patterns that exist. Maybe some of those jobs go away because now somebody really can sort of vibe code, for lack of a better word, that whole system, and you don't need a programmer anymore. The guy that would have been the project manager that needed 5 programmers to get some internal IT project done, maybe that person doesn't need as many programmers. But you'll notice in all this, like, when it's turnkey, then this is just what SaaS software is, right? Why does everybody use Salesforce? Well, it's because it's basically a platform that can be customized. The core part of it doesn't really go away, in my view, right? And in fact, the whole essence of innovation is that the data structures, the infrastructure layers, those continue to advance and they get more sophisticated. AI doesn't do those things. There's no vocabulary for it to put into the AI system to get it to generate the thing that nobody invented yet. Right? Like, that's what humans do. And so, anyway.
So how much, this is probably a good opportunity to zoom out a little bit and look at things at a more macro level. How much do you think all of the stuff that we're seeing in the media right now, in tech in general, is hype versus real? And on that note, do you think we're kind of replaying the dot-com era?
The bubble? Yeah, right. So are we in a bubble right now? Yes. How badly it will pop, good questions, right? So I think there's no question we're in a bubble, right? And the way, like, I like to talk about businesses or industries in various ways, right? So there's fundamentally 3 types of businesses, right? There's the, what I call bankable business, has a cash flow, can go to a bank, get a loan to fund certain initiatives because somebody can show you a spreadsheet with a real financial analyst and sit down and say, yeah, that's pretty darn low risk, right? Like, we can rate that credit, give you the money, expand the business, right? So you got bankable companies, right? That's most companies. You have the true gold mine businesses, which is a Google, a Microsoft, just throwing off Apple, throwing off tons of free cash, right? Like, they can waste billions of dollars. Like Facebook, I just read the other day, I think they spent over 100 or something, like, it was in their earnings rate, 75 billion or 100 billion on the sort of other projects, AI goggles,
side quests,
all this stuff that's, Mark Zuckerberg's dream around the Metasphere before it was, we got to be AI kings, right? So, they can pour literally $75 billion. That's a gold mine, right? And then the other business, all of the businesses are basically Ponzi schemes.
Right.
That I think I alluded to this earlier. Did we talk about it? Yeah, I couldn't remember if it was before or after we started recording, but Ponzi scheme where it's like, it's a Ponzi scheme at the start. It only works because people believe in the story and other people are continuing to put more money into it to keep the story going, right? That's exactly what a Ponzi scheme is in various forms. And so the AI industry right now, to me, is very clearly in a Ponzi scheme because I can't point at any gold mines that are AI native. Like, even OpenAI is not a gold mine. right?
Not yet.
It's a Ponzi scheme, right?
Yeah.
It's not yet, right? And the essence of a VC investment is we invest in Ponzi schemes,
Yeah.
believing that it's going to swap into bankable and eventually be a gold mine, because that's the only reason you would do that, right? And that's the portfolio theory. So if you look around everything going in AI, what's the bankable stuff? What's the gold mines? They don't exist yet. And the fact that we're spending this kind of money, that, a small team of people, I just saw one flapping wings, I think, or flapping airplanes. I forget what it's called. I forget the exact name, kind of a clever name, but it's a, great team of people, phenomenal investors, reputation-wise, certainly. $180 million raise on a team, and they're basically setting up a research lab to go solve AGI in a way that doesn't require lots of data. Like, we're going to do it like humans.
Right.
And, that's the pitch deck. How does that get $180 million, right? Like, that's a Ponzi scheme. They don't know, the very people, I'm sure, that did it. They might have some ideas or insights, but they don't know how they're going to swap out, spend the $180 million and somehow return more than that, right? And so, and I'm not saying this is bad per se, but if I go down the list, everything, the only gold mines are the old guard, right? Google, Microsoft, whatever. They can afford to fund Ponzi schemes in all their various ways, hoping that they create a real cash flow out of it. People like Google is trying to defend the castle because they're essentially being, it looks like they're going to be disrupted. And certainly, and just like the internet, right, the bubble, but then it's a real phenomenon, right? And everybody talks about this. I don't want to rehash bubble dynamics. So I think we're in a bubble. There's no question, right? Like, you can't, there's way too many of the Ponzi schemes out there. They can't all win.
Yeah.
Which leads to a really interesting thing. Like, I think it was it Benedict Evans? I think he used to be at Andreessen Horowitz, right? Like, he's an analyst. He writes some very interesting posts and blogs, and he talks about one of the things you can look at in the industry is there's this weird dichotomous thing going on, which is like, there's OpenAI. They got a chat bot. This chat bot's going to go self-aware, presumably in a couple more years or whatever. Kind of got. That bubble got popped a little bit with even 5.2 coming out. Like, there's a Ponzi scheme story around OpenAI, right? And the easy things that they thought, people aren't just signing up to use the chatbot for various reasons, but the story around it is that's going to do everything, right? Like, you just have a chat interface, and there's no more SaaS software, and there's no more all these specialized applications. You tell it what you want to do, it's going to go do it. There's that version of the world. And then there's the other version of the world, which is there's a zillion SaaS companies sprouting up that are all using language models behind the scenes to improve some customer value chain, but a programmer sits down and figures out how to lay out the screens and what's the interaction model, what are the right data structures, and can AI help write that software? Yes. But does the software completely go away and everything's a chat interface? Okay, which world's right?
Yeah.
Right? We're investing in both of those, and I'm not saying the dichotomy can't be broken. In fact, if we started talking about my current company Reframe, I'm thinking about how you start to break that dichotomy, but there's a really weird conflict in there. So, like, it makes me believe more fundamentally that something like all of the language model development is mostly commodity. It's going to be like electricity, right? Like, in other words, and I'm not saying there won't be advances in everything, but, we're milking right now the language models in the various ways, figuring out how they're useful, where they're useful. There's going to be a big settling out of all the good ways that language models in their current form can be used. And then I think we fall back to, the cycles that we've seen. I mean, everything right now in AI is milking, Transformer from a decade ago now, I think, right? When was the date of the paper? And then you got to go back another decade to say, was it AlexNet? And like, when everybody started figuring out like, oh, we can use a neural net to classify images way better than all the Google services we got through, the 2010s into the early 2020s, we're going to need another 10-year cycle probably for the next leap, right? Like that just, there's too many things language models can't do in their current form. And, Jan LeCun talks about this, all these different, even, was it Andre Karpathy? The people who are real scientists really understand it. These people know, outside of the stories that are told to fund these various Ponzi schemes, they know what the technology can do and not do, right? There's no magic in any of it, unfortunately.
So your assessment is just a matter of time before the bubble bursts. How long, we don't know.
Right.
My question now then is, who are the winners here, if any, and who are the losers? Because it is a big bubble, right? If you think of the amount of capital that has gone into AI
So
infrastructure.
This happened in all the previous bubbles, right? Like, I can say, like, VC, it was funny, I talk about Ponzi scheme business. I think VC firms, most of them are Ponzi schemes, right? Because if we look at the success rate of a given firm, somebody has a reputation, a good story, they figure out how to raise some money, set up a fund, invest, most of those funds don't return, don't get new money,
Right.
kind of die on the vine, right? And then there's the actual gold mine VCs, all the big brands that we know about who have set up a sustainable, have swapped out the sort of Ponzi scheme because of their scale, networking connections, understanding of the industry to be able to build, where they can have a business model to turn the Ponzi schemes with some statistical probability into gold mine, right?
Yeah.
Netting out for their investors. So there's a small number of gold mine firms, those guys all survive, right? All these other firms surrounded money that raised on the AI hype and there are different theses for the market, all those are going to go the way of the Ponzi schemes, right? And that's the bubble popping. So I think private equity and the money going into that's where all the money goes poof. But that's what happened in every other bubble too. The one other thing that's really interesting in this bubble, I think, is the fact that the gold mines of the existing industry, because we've kind of learned after, the various cycles of technology disruption that, somebody like a Microsoft knew how, realized Bill Gates, shrewd enough, certainly based on history and his ability to realize Microsoft was being disrupted by the internet, right? Like, Netscape and all that stuff happening. I mean, they turned the Queen Mary of a ship on a dime to, defend against and deal with it. All of these companies now are much better run than a lot of traditional companies were in the past, non-tech companies. Like this is how, Facebook can spend $50 billion and they can afford to lose $50 billion, right? This is just money coming in. They have a gold mine, whatever, a couple gold bars here, a couple gold bars there. They can do that all day long as the, especially in the name of fighting off the existential threat that's going to, cause the mine collapse or whatever.
I think we're almost out of time. So I've got one final question that hopefully will tie all of this together. And that is, if AGI doesn't happen or it happens way into the future, is there anything that permanently changes after this wave of AI? What is your assessment?
You mean kind of like, is there societal damage occurring? Or
well,
whatever?
both. I was thinking more in terms of the industry, but societal damage for sure as well.
Right. Yeah. So like, I think this idea, what was the one, you had this sort of the projection around AGI and when does it happen? AGI 2027 or whatever. Yeah. Obviously the horizon's been moving on that, right? And, a lot of people talk about the existential threats and the doom and gloom, the idea that like, intelligent AI is going to take over the world and kill all of us or whatever, Terminator style or something, Skynet, whatever. I don't think those are the cases, right? Like, I do think that there is, like anything, you come out with a mechanical weaving machine, obviously it disrupts the weavers, right? It's kind of weird that this one appears to be sort of disrupting the knowledge industry, but I think that's a very short run way of looking at it. In the same way I was talking about programmers, everybody who's a knowledge worker can just be more productive. It's the economic multiplier in theory should increase over the long run, not necessarily in the short run. Over the long run should increase. This is what technical progress is. This is how you make wealthy nations and wealthy world. Can they be weaponized in bad ways? I actually think you've seen in the previous decade social networks weaponizing not language models in their current form, but just machine learning, old school AI, I guess I'll call it. Yeah. Weaponizing it. Like that bad stuff's already happened. Facebook to me is the cigarette companies of our age, right? Like it's like, they're the digital cigarette companies, but what they're doing, and various people have a very addictive product that people make money off of. And, that was probably even preventable. That's, so it's those kind of things that I think happen more so than like, eaten by robots or whatever, right? If you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but overall, you're definitely way more optimistic than pessimistic.
Yeah, I am, I think. I think I worry more about the social dynamics that have happened than the sort of technological adaptation, right? In other words, the way that democracy seems to be retreating around the world, things like that. Those are the more sort of scary ones. Is this tied into technology and AI? Like, in other words, I think the bad stuff was sort of already happening, but this goes in cycles. If you look at history, 100 years, 200 years, those kind of things. Yeah, maybe to your question, I'm very optimistic, but I think it takes real leadership. It takes people looking at the long run, and I think most of the people who are on this are either trying to defend their empires or they think they're doing the right thing. There might be some exceptions there, but for the most part.
Awesome. I think you the last couple of sentences gave us a pretty good preview into what the next episode that we record could be, the social implications and where we go long term from here. But thanks, Jeff, for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
Look forward to continuing the conversation over dinner.
I look forward to episode number 3 too.
Number 3. We'll get a hat trick in.